Hey all, this is Ron Coddington from Military Images Magazine, coming to you on a Friday evening, getting ready to start the weekend. And I was going through some of my old photographs in recent days and came across an image that I have a sentimental attachment to. It's the first Civil War soldier carte visite that I ever added to my collection. And I realized I had never scanned it made a digital scan and put it into the archives. And so I thought, gosh, I should really do that because it's a good thing to do to preserve images. I've talked about this before on previous broadcasts about digital imaging, but it's also because he has an interesting story and an interesting connection. So let me tell you about my experience first, because I have the sentimental connection to it. It was in October of 1980, and I was a kid. I didn't really know much about photographs. Yes, hello, Nikki. This is the photograph that started it all. I really didn't know much about photography, but I was so interested in these images. And at the time, in 1980, I was getting into the mail order catalogs, which I had learned about through going to flea markets and antique shops. And so I found out about this one catalog called Antiques Americana. And the person who owned it was a gentleman named K.C. Owings. And so I began getting these catalogs. Hey, Mike, how are you doing tonight? I began getting these catalogs. And in one of those first catalogs was this photograph. And my recollection is that the image in the catalog was a tiny, tiny thumbnail, and I was barely able to make it out. Hey, Mike, how are you doing today? So I was barely able to make it out, but it was a whopping $8.50. So I had my mother write a check for $8.50 and sent it off to Antiques Americana. And in the mail came this photograph. And so I was completely entranced. I didn't really know much about cartes de visite. I didn't know much about Civil War photography, but I did know that that it was something that was special and something that I wanted to find out more about. One of the really interesting things about this photograph, to my, let me see, I'll do the math, to my 17-year-old mind, was that he didn't look like he was that much older than me. And also it was signed with his name, E.H. Martindale. And it also says lieutenant and aide de camp. So I began pouring through books at local libraries. I learned about the National Archives and everything that they had, and began to compile a little bit of information about him. At the time, I was also a budding artist. I loved to draw. My goal in life at that time was to draw the perfect portrait. And as you know, drawing someone's face and drawing their hands is complicated and difficult. And so I was struggling to learn how to draw. And I was drawing from the photographs as I was buying them. And so in my files the other night, I found the drawings that I did of this image. So there's actually two that I want to share with you. And let's see, I drew them on tissue paper. So they're very light and they're very faded. So I'm going to put them against the back of a piece of paper. So maybe you can see them a little better. There's one. And what I did is I drew his face. I'll hold it up a little closer. Oh, there you go. That's maybe even better. I drew his face, and then I did a mirror image. And then in the middle, I drew what I thought he might look like if you were looking at him straight on. At the same time, I was also fascinated by uniforms and thought, gosh, we only have a bust portrait of him. What would he look like if he was a lieutenant and an aide de camp in full uniform? So I began going through my Civil War books and finding images of staff officers and noticing that they wore long boots. They had a sword. They had sometimes a slouch hat. And so I created what I thought he might look like based on my original sketch. So you can see that here. And I'll hold this up a little closer. Maybe you can see it better. So I used photo reference to make up the body, have him striking a Napoleonic-like pose. He has his hat, his sword, a holster with a gun in it. He has his long boots on, his frock coat, shoulder straps, the whole deal. So here's a better, I had made a print of it at some point along the way, and it's so old now that it's yellowed. We're going back 42 years ago. Not that I'm counting, but so here's another image that might be a little bit easier to see. So this was my way of trying to understand what he might have looked like, but it was also an investigation to try to figure out what kind of uniform he was. I was 17 years old and trying to learn what the soldiers wore, what kind of equipment they carried. So the act of drawing his uniform and researching it was something that helped me to actually learn about how to draw and to learn about the Civil War. So Paul, thank you very much. I spent a lot of time trying to get proportions correct. That was something that I was rather obsessed with when I was a teenager. So that's the story of the photo. And I don't know how, if you are a collector that's watching this right now, I don't know if you've collected or pardon me, have saved one of your original, that first image that you purchased. But I did, and I saved a bunch of my early images. I will confess I'm not a big seller or a trader, but I'm also not a hoarder. But this was an important image to me. So I should tell you a little bit about him. His full name is Edward Holden Martindale. He was born in New York, around the Rochester area. His father was, as I mentioned earlier, was a general. And this is a face, and a face you might recognize. This is John Henry Martindale, his father, who was a brigadier general in the early part of the war, serving in the Corps. His commanding officer was Fitzjohn Porter. So when the war begins, Martindale, who is a West Pointer, he volunteers his services as a military trained man. And when you think about the population of the United States, which was booming at that point, and the relatively small size of West Point and the small size of the US Army, there really wasn't a lot of military trained folks to handle the influx of volunteers. So Martindale is in demand, as all the West Pointers are. So he gets in and he wants to get a commission for his son, Edward. So he writes to the governor of New York and manages to get Edward a first lieutenant's commission in the 41st New York Infantry. There's no evidence that I could find that Edward ever served in the 41st. He was never in camp with them, didn't do any campaigning. From what I've read, his father arranged the commission simply so he could have his son on his staff. And so there's probably a number of reasons for that. Perhaps being protective of his son, perhaps wanting to help groom him by introducing him to generals and their staffs. Whatever the reason, whatever the motivations, at the moment, I haven't been able to find them, and I still don't know what those motivations are. But bottom line is Edward is on his father's staff, and he serves in the Peninsula campaign. He then winds up in Washington, D.C., after his father is appointed, I believe it's military governor of Washington. And then he leaves the army in 1863, 1864, resigns, and then goes back to New York. So Edward, there's two incidents that I do want to mention. One of them happens in March of 1862. It's just before the Peninsula Campaign begins, right around the beginning of it. And Edward wanders into brigade headquarters, and one of FitzJohn Porter's staff members happens to be in the headquarters. And I don't really know what exactly happened between these two, but it ended with Martindale, young Martindale, insulting one of FitzJohn Porter's staffers, using profanity. He gets written up, accused of violating the third article of war. FitzJohn Porter gets involved. Martindale's father gets involved. General Martindale promises that when my son gets back to camp, I'm going to discipline him and I'm going to make him apologize. He writes a letter, and you can find that letter in the National Archives. So Martindale says, I'm going to make sure my son does this thing. So we can assume that the general, I don't know if he was paying lip service or what, but he basically reprimands the son. And then the Peninsula Campaign happens. And a couple months later, young Edward is getting written up in his father's reports for his gallantry and doing good things. So a little bit of a good and bad thing going on there. Dad maybe stepping in again to make sure that his son is being taken care of. So that's one event, one of the two events I want to tell you about. The other one happens a little bit later. We're in I believe it's early 1864, around the time he's planning to resign. He's with his dad in Washington, D.C., and apparently he's a little bit of a man about town. He starts hanging out with a young woman. Her name is Alida Carroll, and Alida is a friend of Elizabeth Blair Lee. If you know Blair House in Washington and Frank Blair, the something of a Washington dynasty, Elizabeth Blair Lee is part of that family. She leaves behind letters, a number of letters, which are published later on in the 20th century. And in one of those letters is a reference to the young man here, Edward Martindale. And the exact quote, and this is Elizabeth Blair Lee writing, and she says, Alida Carroll has been here some days, and I believe here means Blair House. Alida Carroll has been here some days, has a handsome beau, a son of General Martindale's dancing in attendance. So seems to me that young Martindale is courting Alida Carroll. It didn't come to much as far as I can tell, because that's the only reference to Alida Carroll or to young Martindale wandering in the fanciful Washington circle of the Blairs. What does happen is after the war is over, Martindale leaves Washington and he does marry. And he winds up going out to the Midwest. He heads out, he lands in St. Louis, where he begins a career. You might get the idea that he sort of goes off on his own. He's been with his family. He's been under his father's watchful eye pretty much since the war. And he goes out to St. Louis. There seems to be a little bit of maybe an independent streak here. I don't want to read too much into it because I don't know what motivated him to go to St. Louis, but go to St. Louis he does, and enters into the insurance, the world of selling insurance. And he winds up getting a job working for a secretary, or pardon me, working as a secretary in a St. Louis insurance company. So a few years into this job, we're looking at 1874, he collapses, suffering what at the time they called I can't even say apoplexy. It's a cerebral hemorrhage or a stroke. And he collapses and he does not survive. He dies in 1874. And he's a young man, relatively young man. He's only 33. When the word comes in to his parents were just returning from a trip to Europe. They get to back home, and they get the word that their 33-year-old son, Edward, has passed. And I try to put myself in the family shoes. I try to think about General Martindale, who may have been protective of his son, kept him close, kept him on his staff throughout the Civil War into Washington, D.C. And then at some point after the war, he strikes out on his own. And a few years later, he collapses and dies. So thus is the end of Martindale. But at some point, he posed for this photograph. And this photograph probably made its way into an album. It could have been Alita Carroll's album for all I know. I'm not sure. Could have been a family album. I don't know what the provenance is of the image other than that Antiques Americana catalog. So for the better part of 120 years, this photograph was in someone's album or some personal collection, maybe tucked into a book. I don't know. It's in remarkably good condition. And it shows up in this catalog in 1980, as I mentioned earlier. And young me buys it just because I think it's really cool. And I'm too young to realize to ask questions like, well, what was the provenance? Do you have other images in your collection? I wasn't thinking that way at that time. I was so fascinated by the imagery that I had sort of a tunnel vision around that. So, but this image was saved. It's been in my collection, and having the opportunity to share it with you tonight after coming across it a few days ago is something that I really wanted to do, because his story has been tucked away for so long, and this image has been sitting hidden. I did post it on my Flickr photo stream, which you can go find if you want to read the little write-up that I did on him. So that's the story of Edward Holden Martindale. It's also my story of the first Civil War soldier carte visite that I added to my collection. So thanks so much for listening. Wish you a great evening and happy weekend. Take care.